102 din po.
All right, folks, welcome back to yet another episode of the Fatal Conceits podcast. As you know, this is a show about money markets, mobs, and manias. If you haven't already done so, please head over to bonnerprivateresearch.substack.com. You check out our Substack newsletter there. It's a free daily missive. And you'll be able to find hundreds of articles on everything from high finance to lowly politics and plenty more besides, including many more conversations like this one under the Fatal Conceits podcast tab at the top of the page. I'm delighted today to welcome, I think for the first time, a cartoon avatar onto the show after 80 or so episodes. Of course, you'll recognize the Worried Chicken as the author of the wildly popular Doomberg newsletter. You can catch him over at doomberg.substack.com, where he writes about energy, finance, and the economy at large, or join his legions over on Twitter, at Doomberg pardon me, is the Twitter handle over there, just showing my age and lack of Twitter experience there. Doomberg, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Joel, Happy New Year. Great to be here. Congratulations on the success of your Substack, and always a pleasure to talk to another content creator who's managed to carve out some success in this endeavor.
No, thanks very much. Likewise. Actually, I had, we were just speaking before we hit record, I had another fellow Substacker, Edwin Dorsey, who writes the excellent Bear Cave newsletter on just last week. And we were speaking about exactly that subject, actually, about the kind of eroding trust in mainstream media, these kind of banner outlets, that I won't perhaps name, but everybody knows them, and then the kind of consummate or the rise of alternative media platforms, just like Substack, on the other side. What's, in your opinion, been the driving catalyst behind that kind of trend over the last couple of years, in particular, I guess?
It's a great question, and one that we've given a lot of thought to, obviously, and part of the reason why we decided to start Doomberg almost 2 years ago now. There's sort of two factors at play in our view. One is there is, of course, this polarization within the country, and the mainstream media, regardless of your political views, is pretty undeniable to admit the fact that the traditional mainstream media, LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, with the rare exception of, say, Fox News, is predominantly left-leaning, which leaves half of the addressable market roughly wide open for people to go and grab. But it's not just that. I also think the rise of publications like ours and yours and Edwin's and many of the other successful Substacks, for example, are driven by merit. So it's sort of a return to a free market in journalism. I would compare the old guard as sort of tenured professors. They're there because they're there. ABC News is ABC News, and they get their seat at the White House. And if you look, I mean, the most successful Substack on the platform, at least it was at the time that they last posted the sort of overall leaderboards, was this very left-leaning Substack, Letters from an American. And so it's not just that these alternative media are catering to or serving some, right-wing inefficiency in the market that is left open, but also I just think audiences are able and willing to vote with their wallets on merit. And I would say, if we take Edwin, for example, Edwin has a niche, which is exposing fraud and corporate malfeasance. Edwin is very good at what he does. He's very young in his career. He's very passionate about his work. He's developed a reputation. He's exposed some real fraud in a way that you would never expect to see in traditional media outlets. They're more archaeologists than they are detectives, much like the regulators. And so as Edwin builds a track record, he builds a loyal following, and he has earned the right to make a living doing the Bear Cave, and congratulations to him. Now, I would say for every Edwin, as you know, there's a dozen or two people who try and don't succeed. And why is that? It's merit. And so people sort of ask us how we managed to make Doomberg as successful as we've been as fortunate to have made it. We work very hard on the quality of our pieces, the excellence in our editing, the tightness of our photoshopping and our charts. We take pride in having a high density of knowledge relative to the word count in our pieces, and then we market them effectively. in our view. And when you combine all that together with our backgrounds, we have interesting things to say, we think. But ultimately, it's the market that decides it. And so judging by the number of subscribers we've been able to accumulate and the relatively low turnover that we've enjoyed and the lifetime value of the customer that Stripe tells us that we have, the market says that we have earned the right for this voice. And if somebody displaces us or does a better job, then either we improve or we step aside. And that's missing in the traditional media. I think the analogy of the tenured professor with the fixed curriculum, regardless of the customer value proposition of the student at a university, I think that metaphor for the traditional media is one that works quite well.
Yeah, very apt, very apt. How do you think we got away from this meritocracy? I mean, it seems what you're saying seems to make total sense. It seems that, you know, obviously the better a job you do, the more reputational, you know, gravitas one has or one earns. How did it become such that the establishment media came to, is it just a matter of them resting on their laurels, or is it just that they weren't disrupted? Was there kind of regulatory capture? Maybe it's a combination of all of the above.
So I have a slightly different take, which is as the media business became commoditized by Google and Facebook, the first victims to fall over were the rural newspapers and the local newspapers. And everything began to be concentrated in the cities where you have a lot of the politics and a lot of the big companies and so on. But also you have critical mass of a newsroom in New York City, as opposed to, you know, distributed reporters all over the country. And if you just look at the sort of electoral map of the US, I would say that the concentration of professional reporters in blue counties is very high. And if you just poll reporters, you know, 90 to 95% of them would lean Democratic. And so I do think it's an economics that washed out sort of the pyramid of distributed local reporters, and all you had left were reporters that lived in the big city. And then you have a massive market in flyover country, which explains why a Rush Limbaugh, for example, was so successful for so long, or that, like, you know, local radio was sort of the last vanguard of conservative reporting. Whatever you think of those, you know, of Rush Limbaugh or conservative radio, you can't deny that they A, exist, and B, were wildly successful financially. And I think that the lack of a meritocracy, because again, like, nobody questions why does CBS have a seat at the White House for the daily briefing, but you could never imagine Michael Schellenberger getting one, even though he's a wildly popular Substack who does very good original reporting, who writes excellent pieces that are tightly edited. You're never going to see Barry Weiss now that she has sort of left the old guard of the New York Times and created this wildly successful Substack. The chasm between the sort of cocktail party circuit universe that traditional reporters live in and the real world where merit matters is profound. And I think that explains a lot of it. But I don't necessarily assign a nefarious motivation to it. I just think it was an unfortunate evolution of the manner in which the economics of reporting has changed. And the first casualties being sort of distributed local reporters, and investigative reporting went by the wayside as newspapers struggled to respond competitively to Google and Facebook, who basically stole their intellectual property. They got desperate and more desperate for clicks. And the advertising model is a challenging one because it forces you to be, you know, everything is breaking news. I'm old enough to remember growing up where breaking news meant you actually had to stop and see what was going on because something important had happened. And now, like, right. And now it's just clickbait after clickbait after clickbait. Whereas you have to have some interesting aspects of the marketing of your product. But if our writing wasn't any good, it would just be gimmicky, and gimmicky is not durable. And so that's sort of a long answer to your question, but I think it's an important one and one that we've thought a lot about.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you mentioned Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger. We're actually in touch with Mr. Schellenberger. I hope to get him on the show in the near future. But it's we see also, along with sort of Matt Taibbi and a lot of other journalists who were formerly in that sort of establishment vanguard, are also migrating over to Substack. I think lending platforms like this a lot of weight and gravitas. And, you know, these are people who spent, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, sometimes more, in the traditional media, who know the business, who are, you know, not sort of in their parents' basement, that kind of mischaracterization of a lot of people. So I'm wondering, you're a lot more active on social media than we are at Bonner Private Research. In particular, you've got a legion of Twitter followers. I'm wondering, with regards to that kind of part of certainly the investment information landscape, if you've noticed a difference in the and I won't call it post Elon Musk era. He is stepping down as CEO at some time in the future, but obviously a lot was written about shadow banning and fact checking, and now we have the Twitter files coming out. Obviously the people at the Free Press with Barry Weiss and the aforementioned Mr. Schellenberger are doing a great job in exposing pretty much everything we thought was happening over there. Where quote unquote conspiracy theory that were going around have been, more or less confirmed. What's your experience been like over on Twitter during the past, say, couple of years when all this has been taking place?
So that's an interesting question. And for us, I would say not much has changed because we have a rule with our Twitter account, which is if we would never write about it, we don't tweet about it. And we're on Twitter predominantly because that's where a huge chunk of our potential customers are. And we participate in FinTwit, which is financial Twitter. And I would estimate there are probably 500,000 people that use Twitter exclusively for FinTwit. And since we're predominantly serving investors, although we don't give investment advice, we pride ourselves on teaching complex things to financial professionals in a language they can understand. The pond of potential customers and people who would be interested in reading our Substack is huge on Twitter. But the Twitter files and the shadow banning and the COVID crisis, those don't really affect FinTwit. And so I'm not aware of any sort of big FinTwit accounts that were shadow banned, at least not general ones. If some of them veered off into the COVID space, there's no question, like I do think that the Twitter files do expose a scandalous, collaboration between government and big business, which is kind of what I thought the definition of fascism was.
Right.
Growing up, like the literal definition of it.
But another story you won't see covered in the New York Times or the financial press or the mainstream press, rather.
But since our Substack would never write about it, and we had decided early on, for example, that we were not going to be a COVID Substack. We have our views on COVID, but our personal views on COVID are not what we want to put through the Doomberg channel. Again, the Doomberg exists to write about energy, crypto, macro, and the economy at large. To the extent that COVID affects those things, we'll certainly write about them. So, for example, the reopening of China and its impact on oil demand. But to get into the sort of social wars of the day was something that we tried to avoid. Now, look, you could create an amazing business doing that because the outrage machine is great for clicks. And we're not above like trying to get our share of the clicks. I mean, we're in the clicks business like everybody else. But it's just something we decided that we weren't going to do. And as a consequence, other than a little bit of clunkiness in using Twitter post Elon, which was probably expected, we haven't really been impacted by, we've probably been negatively impacted in the sense that because we're not writing about it and it's the story of the day, eyeballs are shifting to other Substacks, which is fine. I mean, but the pendulum swings. And so, for example, if Elon released a bunch of files about how the Biden administration was censoring any critical response to global warming, that's something we would be writing about because that's right down the middle for Doomberg. So one thing we tried to do is be brand consistent. You don't want to confuse people with your brand. And our brand objective is when people get, an email from Doomberg, the gut feeling we induce in them is, ooh, I get to read that. And if we started writing about, the abortion or gender or all the things that we've never written about 165 pieces in, we would confuse that brand. And we would no longer be delighting our ideal. We'd be delighting some of our ideal customers, but we have a pretty diverse set of views along those dimensions that we'd rather not wade into.
Don't want to alienate unnecessarily. So let's talk about energy then. I know this has been a big focus of yours over the past couple of years, and I mean it is one of those subjects that there are certain sort of third rail sort of components of it. And I was rereading your piece on Carl Sagan earlier today with regards to the whole scientific process, and it's a very interesting piece. I encourage our listeners to head on over to your Substack at Doomberg there and check it out, along with a bunch of your other writings. But I want to ask, this is another kind of arena where there is this sort of unquestionable orthodoxy surrounding climate change. That bleeds over into the investment realm when it sort of trespasses on regulatory ESG stuff, what you can and can't say there. There are obviously, climate activist board members on major oil and gas companies, certainly in the US, and I would imagine across Europe as well. How do you think that is impacting the reality, just the sort of basic, supply demand 101 reality as reflected in the price? And what are we looking at for this year, 6-12 months down the line?
So this is an example of a category where we would confront, government regulators and speak to those third rails and taboos. We are, it just as background for listeners who may not be familiar, I'm a trained scientist with several decades of experience in the commodity sector, including a lot of work in the renewable space. And one of the things that's most disturbing about the way the media is covering science, so back to the whole question of the media, is in fact this whole very scary concept of, quote, settled science. There's no such thing, of course. And the entire scientific method is built upon nullification. And you cannot, the other thing is, like, when I hear phrases like 98% of scientists agree, you shudder. Because this is, 98% of scientists were against Galileo too. And it's just like, rounding up, two significant figures. The polling wasn't quite as accurate back then. But in all seriousness, we are a physics-based newsletter. And one of the things that's interesting is to observe, physics can't be denied. And so we know what is possible and what isn't. And when governments persist on impossible policies, we're the only equalizer is destroying people's standard of living. Like, that's the only event that re-achieves equilibrium. Then you could say, like, if you keep persisting in this way, there will be revolt. Like, one of the phrases we coined was, on the path from abundance to starvation is riot. The people will revolt, and there will be political upheaval. And we saw that early on during the energy crisis. Now, ultimately, when you are persisting in a time of primary energy abundance, energy appears to act just like any other commodity. But when you are in times of energy scarcity, energy becomes the master resource. And we saw both of those situations. So in the US, because of the shale gas revolution, for the better part of a decade, the world had an abundance of excess primary energy, and life was good. And you could treat oil and gas companies and stocks with a bit of disdain, and nothing would happen. But in the post-COVID world, where suddenly we had energy scarcity, the price elasticity of demand of energy, because energy is life, is very steep. And we saw these record enormous price gaps, especially in Europe, the sort of beating heart of the ESG religion. And we saw natural gas spike to as high as $100 per million BTU. And what has happened? Physics took over, and they bought every source of BTU they could, regardless of carbon footprint. They're burning coal as fast as they can. They're importing natural gas. Germany has amongst the brownest electricity grids in the developed world. And they spent $500 billion just to get through this winter. And we're blessed, by the way, with an extremely long and persistent bout of warm weather in the past 6 to 8 weeks, which has thankfully taken off much of the worst case scenario risk that Germany and Central Europe and Western Europe were facing coming into this winter. And we suspect, and we fear, that the very worst of those lessons will be taken. This was fine. Never mind that they could have built an entire generation's worth of nuclear reactors with that $500 billion, but instead they wasted it, squandered it on 1 year's worth of oil, natural gas, and coal. And so they'll learn all the wrong lessons, and we'll be doing it all over again next winter. And let's hope that the rest of this winter is as mild as it has been. But we've seen the blow off top and then the collapse in energy prices, at least natural gas in Europe, is it actually proof of our belief, which is that these things are essential to life, and what is the elasticity of demand for life, and who can afford to pay it? So right,
yeah, well said. It is a little it's a very doom and gloomy to kind of consider it that way. But I personally, I can't see the people who are, at the vanguard of implementing the kinds of, policies that drove advanced industrialized nations like Germany that you mentioned toward, toward the cliff. I just can't see these people reversing course or sort of swallowing their pride. It seems like they'll double down. But I mean, what does this mean if we go back to an era of sort of pre-industrial revolution living standards, just to take it to the, to the nth degree? What does that ultimately mean for the additional, whatever, 6 or 7 billion people that the global population has added to the world since then? Is it as dire as, well, they just pay the where common sense and reason take over?
So here's where a physics-based approach can help you, because you can partition the countries into 2 categories: those that are unserious about physics and those that are. And as a consequence of that partitioning, you will find no discussion of this nonsense in China, India, right. Saudi Arabia. The Chinese are building, in the process of building 150 nuclear reactors. Indians are pursuing nuclear as well, but in the meantime, they're buying up coal and oil and getting close with the Middle East and the whole BRICS collaboration and what that means for the dollar and how energy is settled in the future. The Chinese aren't messing around, and they're busy building pipelines to Russia because they'll happily take the commodities and sell them value-added goods in return. And the countries that don't get serious about it will be left to weather on the vine. But ultimately, the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting battle against the forces of entropy. You need to waste energy in order to beat back entropy. Your standard of living is literally defined by how much energy you get to waste. Getting to waste a lot of energy is a privilege. Proactively choosing to forego access to primary energy is a literal proactive decision to degrade your standard of living. And to the extent that populations are willing to put up with that in the name of some cult or some religion, doesn't mean that it has to necessitate that their standing in the geopolitical chess game will go down. Now, there's 2 countries that are interesting because they're in this game, which I watch very carefully because they were so blessed with an amazing overabundance of primary energy and mining materials, but yet amongst the societies, they're the most fervent in their sort of regularly attending the Church of ESG, let's say. They're there every Sunday with their Sunday best on, and that's Canada and Australia. Canada and Australia have so many, and if you divide the resource bounty by the population, the citizens of Canada and Australia have amongst the best balance sheets on the planet. And yet, the electricity grid in Australia struggles, and there's, the price of gasoline in Canada is off the charts. And so those are the 2 places where if we see political upheaval and we see change in government and we see a change in direction energetically on the domestic front, that's kind of a milestone we're looking for sort of peak unseriousness. If it may be like Europe, they don't have the energy resources and they refuse to develop the ones they have, and they still think that they're the colonial powers of the earth. And so, Europe is a garden and we shouldn't develop our energy here. Why would we, put an oil rig in the middle of a garden? We'll outsource that. The NIMBYism is very strong.
Let's put a wind farm there instead.
Yeah, exactly. Cut down trees and put a wind farm instead. It's crazy. But or burn wood that we clear cut in the U.S. Southeast. But by and large, I think China, and the U.S. won't fall into this trap. I mean, the U.S. is ultimately the biggest beneficiary of European scientific collapse by filling in the gap with our LNG and elevating domestic profits for our energy producers. And thanks to the shale gas revolution, the U.S. is relatively energy balanced. But also we say, if we draw a box around Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., you have this NAFTA energy commodity superpower. And we'll eventually get our act together long before we would suffer the consequences of what Europe has put themselves through. The U.S. political system is a little more balanced, and even Biden, who's old school politician, watches the price of gasoline like a hawk, and ultimately he will bend to the will of Joe Sixpack than he will to the sort of environmental radicalists in his relatively dispersed coalition of political supporters.
Gotcha. Yeah, well said. It's interesting, the Canada Australia observation. I was trying to guess which countries you were going to go with. Before that, I spent a little bit of, you probably can hear from my accent, I hail from Australia, and I have all kinds of horror stories from friends and family there who, many of whom work in or have friends or extended family who work in the oil and gas sector or the mining sector, and who are scratching their heads when they watch their energy bills or their utility bills going through the roof, while they have, been blessed with this absolute cornucopia of natural resources right at their doorstep. But they're sacrificing it, as you say, on the altar of this kind of new climate change religion. But I'm interested that you mentioned the BRICS sort of coalition of countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I've spoken to a few guests on the show before who have talked about a kind of extrapolating out this deglobalization across the world. We see this bifurcation of not just resources, but also payment methods, with, the SWIFT kind of on the G20 side, and now a kind of coalition of some of the countries that you mentioned. Do you think that this kind of struggle for increasingly scarce, or let's say less freely traded natural resources is going to accelerate that monetary bifurcation? What's your take there?
At the highest level, if 40 years of globalization drove disinflation, then the reverse of that has to drive inflation. Now, I think we're going to come into a series of year-over-year comps that make headline CPI look like it's coming back under control, and that may be true, and we would certainly be happy with that. But if you read Zoltan Posner's latest piece,
Credit Suisse,
Credit Suisse, yeah.
And
I think it was called War and Commodity Encumbrance. It was a fascinating piece, and I found myself not disagreeing with very much of it. And I do think 2023 is going to be the year where the U.S. dollar hegemony is tested for the very first time. And as Luke Gromen would say, another friend of ours who's been on this for a very long time, and the founder of a really great research newsletter called The Forest for the Trees, it doesn't take a full displacement of the U.S. dollar in energy transactions. Prices are set at the margin. And so in the sort of dollar dominant sense, 10, 15, 20% displacement of the dollar by, say, the petro-yuan in this case, as Groman and Zoltan lay out, would be enough to be a very substantial shift. Back to the whole subprime is contained. Yes, sure, but it's
right. Contained. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So and there's going to be a push, and so the big question, of course, is historically, and in a total coincidence, anytime there's been a push away from the dollar, war follows shortly thereafter. And we had a total coincidence, and we had our Doomberg Pro tier. We had our year in review 2023 predictions, Doom Zoom in late December, and we predicted that a major push by BRICS would occur, and that push would tip perhaps China and Taiwan, and by extension the U.S. into a kinetic conflict in 2023. That's on the scary part of the predictions. It's and we hope it doesn't come to pass. But it's hard to see. The interesting run in gold here at the beginning of the year, and China again announcing another 30 tons, which probably means that's some fraction of what they actually bought. It's a fascinating situation that bears watching. One that, to be totally transparent, is not directly in our wheelhouse of expertise. We turn to people like Zoltan and Luke Groman, and the counter views as well. Your Brent Johnsons and so on. And we read with interest like everybody else, and occasionally comment on it. But I can't see a scenario where a true dedicated push by that, because you're talking Russia, you're talking India, you're talking China, Saudi Arabia, if they join. Saudi Arabia is the key fulcrum, of course, because they have so many resources and have been basically propped up by the U.S. regime for decades. It doesn't seem like the Biden-MBS relationship is getting better anytime soon.
Despite the fist pump, that didn't seem to go over particularly well.
If you compare the way President Xi was welcomed, just the visual differences were pretty pronounced. But that's something on the radar to keep a careful eye on. And all bets are off then. Who knows what prices do in that scenario?
Right. Yeah. Well, obviously, a kinetic conflict is something that we would all hate to be right about if that came to pass, certainly. But obviously, a lot of more strictly economic fallout from that continued kind of standoff and brinksmanship. And I know you've written a lot about supply chain issues from food, water, fertilizer, that kind of stuff. I'm expecting you continue to see those fissures kind of exacerbated as this escalates.
Yes, and of course, at the heart of this is semiconductors and Taiwan's critical role in fabrication. But having said that, where does the polysilicon come from that ultimately feeds into these chips? And it comes from China, as we've written about. We were in the solar industry when China illegally dumped cheap solar panels onto the market and basically took over all of the manufacturing aspects of the supply chain to the point where they control, I believe, 97% of ignet production and 98% of wafering. And even the polysilicon that remains here in the US ultimately has to go through China, and it gets commingled with polysilicon derived from the slave labor regions of China that the US is simultaneously trying to sanction. And ultimately, the semiconductor supply chain situation is one that's still worth watching, especially if a kinetic event does occur, in which we hope it doesn't. But beyond that, the entire sort of effort to re-onshore is going to run into various, what we would sort of call high barrier pinch points, where China has complete control. For example, if you just take rare earth metals, we might develop our own mines here if the environmentalists will let us, but almost all the processing of those from concentrate to pure metal is done in China today. Magnesium is a point source of worry, which we've written about early on in Doomberg's life. That is completely controlled by China, and you can't make vehicles without magnesium because of the alloys that they make with aluminum and so on and so on. And so everywhere you look, all it takes is sort of 1 0 and a geometric mean to know what the answer is. And China owns a lot of choke points, and so we have to get smart about diversifying too. Like, for example, in the solar piece that we'd written about, where we talked about this, the fact that Biden was simultaneously sanctioning and yet trying to invest in manufacturing. The piece was called "No Assembly Required," because what the Biden administration might think as manufacturers is in fact just assembly. And if you don't control any of the early manufacturing pieces where you actually transform materials, then you actually are just pulling a brick from the bottom to put it on top in this weird game of political Jenga. And so we have to get serious about it. And there are some signs that we are, but the friction of the transition is going to be interesting to watch, and I suspect pretty challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you mentioned rare earths and of course not only within China itself, but across Africa, a lot of the metals du jour that we rely on that are so integrated into our modernized, industrialized economies that we so rely on for everything from our smartphones to our electric cars, lithium batteries, cobalt. China obviously has its interests, shall we say, spread throughout Africa and other sort of conflict zones. But it strikes me that a delay on what we might call a luxury good like a phone, although I'm sure the millennials would call it a bare necessity or maybe even a human right, that's a far cry from running short of something that is actually a bare necessity, like food, like water, which you've also written extensively about. Do you want to just maybe touch on that real quick and how you see those spaces playing out a little bit going forward?
Well, it's an interesting thing, actually, and let me push back gently on something that you inferred in your question, which is part of the reason why we got into this energy crisis in the first place is an entire generation of people think that phone comes from pushing buttons on a phone. They think that food comes from pushing buttons on a phone, and they literally can't live. Like they hail a ride, they have food delivered, they interact with their friends, their entire lives are on their phones. I know my children basically can't keep their eyes off them, and the one of the reasons we got into this crisis in the first place is that separation between the production of all the things that you need and their consumption. and their consumption is driven entirely by the iPhone. And so if you took away the iPhone, not only would there be panic and social disruption very quickly, it's not like these people can pivot and go grow their own food.
Right. That's a good point.
and so like we've lost those primary skills, and I'm a bit of a preparedness person, and I try to learn how to fish and how to start a fire. And, you know, not that I'll ever need it, because I think the social disruption that would come from this scenario you sketched out would probably overwhelm my ability to persist for very much longer. But at least I'm aware of it. I'm trying. Like, to most people, they literally think we're burning fossil fuels because we hate the environment and oil companies want to make money. No, we're burning fossil fuels because there's no suitable alternative. If we stop burning fossil fuels today, most of you would die. So we're actually doing this for your own sake, whether or not you appreciate it or not. And so, but the Congo situation and cobalt in Congo, I would direct your readers to Pippa Milgram's Substack. She had a great article on the battle over Africa and the commodities. Again, another example of non-traditional media outlet from somebody that you would say has a pretty traditional background. You know, she served in the George W. Bush White House, and she's pretty well connected into DC, but she writes very provocative pieces that are a must read every time they come out. I think it's Dr. Pippa's Pen and Podcast is the name of her Substack, but I think it's just Dr. Pippa or pippa.substack.com. Your readers can find it if they Google it. And she wrote a really great piece. Yeah. And so again, like, my views are informed by people like her who have connections that I don't have. And she's built up a trust with our team, and we know her in real life. And so when she put something out, even Zoltan quoted her piece on Africa in his piece the day before yesterday. And so, yeah, it's one of those worlds, back to the very first question that we started this conversation with. There's a merit-driven, insight-driven sort of free market in news, in education, and entertainment. And we try to do all three of those things. We try to break news, we try to entertain, and we try to educate. And to the extent that we delight our consumers, we will continue to earn the merit of being a successful Substack. And this is what we get to do for a living, because the traditional media left that field open for us to come and take.
Yeah, fantastic. But well, it seems like that's probably a pretty good place to wrap up. I know we've gone a little bit over time for our readers, but I trust they benefited from all your insights. And I had so many other points that I wanted to get to that we kind of sketched out earlier, but perhaps we'll have to get together and take up a part two sometime in the future. But for the moment, thank you so much, Doomberg, for taking the time out of your busy day today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks. It was great. Again, congratulations. Happy New Year to you and the team. And come back anytime you'll have us. So it's always fantastic to talk to other successful Substackers, and really enjoyed it.
Outstanding. Thanks a lot. And to our listeners out there, you can head over and check out Doomberg on Substack. It's doomberg.substack.com. And if for those of you who are inclined towards Twitter, the handle is DoombergT. So you can join Doomberg's many legions over there. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Fatal Conceits podcast. In the meantime, head over to our own Substack at bonnerprivateresearch.substack.com. We'll see you next time.